Sometimes Vietnam comes back to me in a dream as a simple sound. I am a small boy of 8 or 9. I lay awake listening to the murmurs of my own heart. Ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. And suddenly, the sounds are those of exploding B-52 bombs which echoed from a distant battlefield. I am in Hue, where my father was a South Vietnamese military commander near the end of the war. The sounds of the B-52 were for me the sound of security, of the Americans helping to protect us. Yet, for the North Vietnamese, they were the sounds that nightmares were made of.
At the time I was very small, so I go with my mother. And the plane came, and we rushed into the shelter. And when we was the shelter, we feel very frightened, of course, because plane is something very, very powerful, yeah. And the bombing is very dangerous for every people.
But our family belonged to the South, and though I was 11 when the war ended, I was already profoundly marked by war. In 1972, my father was called in to turn the tide against North Vietnamese troops who had invaded Quang Tri province across the DMZ, or demilitarized zone dividing North and South.
The South Vietnamese erupt in a head-on clash for supremacy over the area just south of the DMZ. The fate of South Vietnam's northern province seems to rest on the shoulders of soldiers like these, and it also seemed to be the hopes of the American policy of Vietnamization.
With the help of American bombing under my father's command, we beat back the North Vietnamese then. My father took us to see the aftermath of those terrible battles. 27 years later, I came back to scenes of my childhood memories.
This is the closest landing strip to the DMZ in Quang Tri, and as you can see, it's all bombed out. My father used to fly here from Hue, landing his helicopter, and once in a while he would take me and my brother.
Our family flew out of Vietnam 2 days before Saigon's collapse. In San Jose, California, I recently asked my father about the old battlefields. Why did you take me and my older brother and sister out there?
Because I want you to face the suffering of the people, and also I want you to recognize the sacrifice of the young Vietnamese soldiers who died for the cause of freedom and democracy.
To us as kids all those years ago, the world was so simple then. There was a civil war, and we belonged to the South. This is the land we were fighting over. This is the land my father was sworn to protect.
But as I grew up, I was to find out it was not sacrifice, nor heroics, but rather betrayal that was the only consistent theme of the Vietnam story. Though they had sacrificed 58,000 men in the war, my father reminded me the Americans withdrew military aid to us in 1974.
As a result of that, we ran out of ammunition. We have no more ammunition. We don't have spare parts for our aircraft. We don't have fuel for our trucks. So we have no air support. So that's why we could not, beat back the last NVA offensive in 1975.
And so, instead of fighting, many South Vietnamese fled, shedding uniforms to avoid surrender. The ultimate betrayal, I think, is the one against memory. 25 years on, Vietnam is at peace and flourishing. But on a plane to Saigon this month, a businessman old enough to remember the war, but young enough to remake himself, had this advice for me.
Vietnam is very livable now, the man said. But to live here, you must pretend amnesia. Remember too much, and it will only bring sadness. Oh, and it gets in the way of making money.
I am happy that Vietnam is thriving at last. But if the price to live here is amnesia, then for me at least, it's a price too high to pay. After all, it's difficult to belong to a nation that refuses to acknowledge its history. The cemeteries of northern soldiers are pristine and well kept. But outside Saigon, there is a graveyard of forgotten soldiers, 60,000 or so. This burial place of the defeated army received no honors, no respect. I also want someone to remember that here in Hue, the communists killed thousands of unarmed Vietnamese during the Tet Offensive of 1968. As I journey from Hue to Quang Tri once more, it occurs to me that there will always be two Vietnams. The one here, roaring with life as it yearns to integrate into the global economy. And the other, my Vietnam, one that exists nowhere but in memories. Here then, to memory, day turned into night and my trip from Hue to Quang Tri as a child in my father's helicopter after the battles of 1972. The cool, fresh air, the chopping sounds of the helicopter, and a beautiful moon rising in a darkening sky. Looking down, I saw the moon's reflection racing with us from Lotus Pond to flooded rice field. The rice had ripened, and its fragrance reached my nostrils, along with the smell of the dead killed in battle. It was then I knew no one was left to harvest the rice that season.